Welcome to our program, Pioneers. Today we are very honored to have Professor Andrew Nathan from the Columbia University to join us today to discuss with us on this issue. To many China observers and China studies students, Professor Nathan is a household name already. So, he's professor of politics from from Columbia University, and he has taught at Columbia University since 1971. His teaching and research interests include Chinese politics and foreign policy, and among Andy's many publications, the Tiananmen Papers, edited with Professor Peiling, I think from Princeton University, right?
Yeah, although he has retired from Princeton, and he now teaches at the University of California, Riverside.
Oh, I see. And I think this book, the Tiananmen Papers, would be the most influential and famous one in Hong Kong for other non-experts Chinese people in Hong Kong. So yesterday, Yemen President Ali Abdullah Saleh, hopefully I pronounced it correct, Saleh, was out of his country. And who's next? Do you think China will be the next?
Well, I wish that China would change and would democratize, not necessarily in that way with violence, but I wish China would change. But as you may know, as an analyst, as a scholar, I'm pessimistic that China's political system will fundamentally change anytime in the near future. I find that the system of one-party authoritarian rule is very strong. I sometimes use the word resilient to describe it. It seems to be very strong, and even though they face all kinds of pressure from from social change, from different groups, from the internet, from modern forms of communication, and from outside, it seems to me so far the regime has proven very adaptable, and they're quick on their feet, and they seem to be able to resist the contagion from the Middle East.
The recent development in the Middle East, especially in the Arab world, the revolution has been precipitated by, say, unemployment among youngsters, particularly in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, high unemployment rate, and also the influx of information as a result of Wikipedia and also maybe Facebook. How would you describe this kind of development, the internet and also social media in China?
In China, it seems to me that the economy is still growing, and there are some problems of inflation, but Chinese people still seem to be quite optimistic. They feel that they can get ahead, so it's not like the dead end feeling. And even, in fact, in Tunisia, this is one of the paradoxes of revolution. The economy had been growing. So it's hard to explain. There's no inevitable relationship between the economy and revolution, neither between information, I think, and regime change. But in the question of information in China, it is spreading. The Chinese media are more free, and yet at the same time, the regime is very proactive in shaping what information people get. They go on the internet, they go in the media, they tell their story, and they stop certain kinds of information from spreading. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game about information. And I think that China's ahead of most of the other regimes in information control.
Yes.
Better job of information control than those Middle East regimes.
So that would be very interesting to me as political science studies. And in my university, actually 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we see a lot of books telling that China will collapse in next 5 years, but 5 years later, they will see collapse in next 10 years. So what's your prediction? So will that be a very violent regime change maybe in 5 or 10 years due to something happened?
I don't know. I have trouble seeing what's going to happen next. I think that we say 5 or 10 years. I think the safest prediction in 5 or 10 years is that the system fundamentally won't change. Now, I say fundamentally because, after all, the way the Chinese system works, it does change all the time.
Yeah, it's quite dynamic.
It's dynamic, but it changes as a way of keeping the regime in power. So in that sense, 5 or 10 years, probably the safest bet is to say that the regime will still be in power. Xi Jinping will be in power. Xi Jinping will hand over his power to the next leader. At the same time, we probably can say that sometime, we don't know when, sometime this one-party regime controlled by a tiny elite is going to change in some fundamental way. But I don't know when. And now your question, will that be violent or not? I really cannot tell. I don't feel the forces are so balanced, right? So you have tremendous social change, tremendous social forces, civil society growing all the time on one side. And then on the other side, you have this very strong Communist Party apparatus. You have a strong military, strong People's Armed Police. The two forces are, both very big and strong. And I don't have a clear sense now of what might be the pathway to change. Some people say the party will split, a democratic faction will emerge and lead a change. That is possible. Some people say the party will fall apart and lose faith in itself, the way that the Russian Soviet Communist Party did in the Soviet Union. I mean, it's possible. But right now I cannot predict, because I just don't see the signs on the ground of a clear answer to that question.
But there's a lot of signs that happen in some of the Chinese activists' eyes, that saying there's a lot of protests, people are getting more angry in internet, they're more violent, maybe in saying the word, the claim, the decline in internet. And also, sometimes they have the protests in a violent way. In the local level, suicide, actually, there's a suicide protest. So there's a lot of sign, but it's happened quite a few years ago. And
it's been happening for a long time.
Yeah.
And the regime has ways to deal with that. Partly concessions, partly repression.
Yeah, is there any
maybe
miracle?
Put another way, I think Andy's answer reminds me of the maxim of being a China observer, that making prediction is another occupational hazard. In particular, when in 1991, when not many political scientists would predict that Soviet Union can collapse in such a short period of time. And as you said, China may or eventually may not democratize. In 5 or 10 years' time, the CCP can still maintain its status quo and maybe its legitimacy in a shorter term. But can you tell us or predict the future of China? If that happened, in what form would it end up? In regionalism, warlordism? As I know you have a very good book on warlordism during Republican era, and also would it be a collapse of the unitary state that break into different provincial empires, as Li Tenghui suggested 10, 20 years ago? And how about the party? You mentioned Xi Jinping. Would the breaking down of the party would be along the lines of princelings and the Tuanpai?
So I think it's very unlikely that China will break apart as in the warlord period, because first of all, it's much too integrated economically, and it's moving more in that direction. Secondly, I think the international security environment is very threatening to China, because you have Japan, you have the United States, you have India, and that for its security, China needs to stay together, and that the leadership, whoever they are, will want China to stay together. And I don't think that the public supports a splitting up of China. So I just don't see any support for that. If the leadership splits in some future power struggle, I don't think that either the Tuanpai or the princelings really constitute real interest groups that would stay together. I think it would be, in 1989, for example, Zhao Ziyang was on one side and Li Peng was on on another side. I think because of the way that it basically came down to the experience that each of them had in his job, the way that he thought, his personality, they were faced with a real problem of a challenge from these student movements, and each of them had to deeply dig down to say, how do I believe we can solve this problem? So it's unpredictable how the top leadership would, how each member of the top leadership would respond to some kind of crisis.
How about Grandpa Wen, Premier Wen?
Well, he won't be in power by that time, presumably. But if you said that tomorrow there will be a huge crisis in China and Grandpa Wen will have to decide what to do, well, first of all, he's only the premier, so the premier's power is not really the strongest power to decide these things. It's really the party secretary who has to decide. So Hu Jintao would have the sort of first card to play. But secondly, we don't know what Grandpa Wen really thinks, but if we look at Zhao Ziyang himself, what he said in 1989, what he wrote in his book, Prisoner of the State, what he told his interviews to Zhong Fengming in that book, in my judgment, Zhao did not want multi-party democracy. I think Zhao wanted a one-party system that was more popular, more accountable, more dialogic, if you will, more willing, to talk to social forces. So I would guess that Grandpa Wen, if he had to decide how to deal with a crisis, would still want one-party rule, but he believes that one-party rule can be saved by being more responsible and accountable to the people. So it's more democratic than the vision of somebody like Li Peng or Zhou Yongkang or Bo Xilai, perhaps, but not Western vision of democracy as a truly open, competitive system.
You mentioned Bo Xilai just now, and some peoples in China, particularly those from Chongqing, have very high regards for what he have so far done in that municipality. So what is your comment on him? And as some predict that he may very possibly going to be Politburo members next year.
Probably he will be, and I'm guessing that he will be put in charge of the security system, since Zhou Yongkang has to retire because of age. And I think Bo Xilai, anybody who's in charge of the security system in China is going to be tough. They're going to bring a tough person to do it, and that person is going to have a tough job, and he's going to be in charge of a tough organization, the security apparatus. So Bo Xilai seems like a suitable person in that sense, fitted for the job, and I would think he'll do it in a very tough way. I mean, the security people in China are professional security people. Their job is to keep control, and they have complete freedom to use whatever methods they feel they need to use to do so. So Bo Xilai, I think, in Chongqing is demonstrating his capability to do that.
But he somehow represents the interests and the fashion of the princeling, as we
that doesn't make so much sense to me. I think that he, of course, I mean, there's there's an elite in China that are the privileged people. Some of them are princelings, some of them are those who've come up, like Hu Jintao, through the bureaucracy. And now they are all the power holders, and they all have an interest in keeping the system in power, I think. And the difference is anybody could have an honest difference of opinion if they are in charge of keeping this system in power. How to do that? Should it be more economic growth? Should it be more effective propaganda? Should it be more dialogue with society? Everybody has to try to figure out parts of the answer to staying in power. That's how I see that. I don't see it as a power struggle among the top leaders so much as each person having his own view of how to do a very complicated job of running this huge, complicated society.
But there's still a distinction between the left and the right, even within the party and also outside the party, right?
Well, yes, I think, let's say if the three of us were in charge of China, one of us might argue that, the society is so turbulent, it's changing so fast that we have to give people a clear ideology to rally around, and we have to always show that we're very tough. And we have to rally the vast population with a kind of leftist ideology and symbols. That would be the Bo Xilai view. And then another one among the three of us may say, well, that's all very well, but people have a lot of real grievances, and we have to listen to them and solve their problems and show them that we're taking care of their needs. That would be the Wen Jiabao thing. So you could call that an ideological difference, but it also is a very pragmatic difference, I think, about how to handle this challenge.
But in fact, there is some contradiction between the party members.
Yeah.
Actually, if you take about the Wen Jiabao's speech in China, they're quite forbidden to hear in Chinese. Actually, I see that some of the translations of the Wen Jiabao speech is banned in mainland China because they think that it is quite liberal.
Yeah.
So, is it? We can see that political party members use a very cooperative board, so that they will cooperate with each other. But at the same time, they will try to have some conflict in the speech. So how they are doing each other? So are they in the same party, or they have different?
Well, so I understand that there are some different voices in the party, but I don't. So where I disagree with some analysts is I don't see this as really a sign of a power struggle. I think it's different emphases and also speeches for different audiences and different leaders so some of one's speeches are for foreign audiences, actually. And then they come to the propaganda guys who have to decide how much do we promote this to internal audiences. Even Deng Xiaoping's speeches in 1992,
the Southern Trip, yes.
The Southern Trip were not initially published for the broad people, so they were published inside the party. People inside the party knew about them, but it was a propaganda decision how much you push that stuff out in the internal propaganda. So
that's a role-play game, actually.
So it's sort of a role-playing game, and it's for different audiences, partly. And as I said before, I think there are some authentic differences of view about how you do the job of keeping the party in power, but it's not a disagreement over that principle of staying in power. And also, it's different people have a different job. So Bo Xilai's job is Chongqing. Wen Jiabao's job is mainly is the economy. It includes some foreign relations work and some propaganda work that says the party at the central level cares about the masses. So disasters, the Sichuan earthquake, HIV, AIDS. I mean, the party at the central level has to show the people that it loves the people. So it's somewhat of a different portfolio that each person has. And so there are differences, but not to the extent, in my view, of a power struggle or a difference over this issue of survival of the party.
Speaking of propaganda, is it true that you got on China's bad side by writing about Chairman Mao's line in that manner? You write the preface, and also later on the Tiananmen Papers.
It's true. I got on the bad side of the leadership, anyway, if not China. So, Dr. Li, Mao's private physician, published this book called The Private Life of Chairman Mao, and the publisher asked me to write the foreword to it to explain. So it's a thick book, so you write a short thing to explain to the readers, why is this a book that you want to read?
It's so important.
It's important, and I wrote about that. And so some of the Mao's old comrades in the central leadership felt that this was an attack on Mao, that it was a low blow. Then it was talked about his sex life and things like that. That it was not a fair criticism. It was an attack. So yes, so I was unable to visit China for several years, for 5 years. And then in 2001, as you mentioned in your introduction, Perry Link and I were the co-editors of this book called the Tiananmen Papers, which is a serious political problem for the leadership because it reveals the internal communications of the party around the events, the crisis of April and May of 1989. So it's a serious security leak from their point of view, as well as a political attack.
Yeah, that's a WikiLeaks in China. Yeah.
It has sort of a WikiLeaks before WikiLeaks existed. So, yeah. So that has been I haven't been able to get a visa to China since 2001, but I'm glad that I did that project because I think it's very important.
I read from your interview you have done with the Columbia University Press, I guess, 2 months ago, and you also mentioned that you did want to visit China someday, right?
Yeah, because when I have visited China in the past, I've always found it very useful. It helps me to understand things in a more vivid, concrete way, grassroots way, what people are thinking. And it's such a complicated society that you have to go there to really have a good understation of it. So I
if
would
you
like to
were
go.
in China, what would you do on the first day?
Make trouble, you know. No, you know, if I were in China, I think that one of the reasons that the government doesn't want to give me a visa is that they imagine that if I went to China, I would do something very...
go to worship Zhao Ziya?
do, you know, make contact with some underground forces, but of course I wouldn't do that. That would be very dangerous for the people that I...
You've even done that. You can do that in the States.
In the States?
Yeah, with the
Oh, that's true.
army.
Well, no, but those people are in exile. Yes, no, in the States you can contact everybody. But if I were to go to China, what I would like to do is simply to go around to the grassroots and just talk to ordinary people and just say, you know, what's happening, and come to understand the hukou system and the social welfare system and the medical system and people's daily life and people's thinking, and, you know, which is what I used to do. But since I'm so sensitive, I may just have to only talk to officials so that they won't get in trouble.
So would you foresee that they would grant you a visa, say, after next year, after the Politburo new members coming in?
Well, I should think not before that, but then the trouble is that my visa is connected to Liu Si in a way, so I think it probably wouldn't happen until there's some rethinking about Liu Si, and I don't know when that will be.
Yeah, I think this is the next question I want to ask you. After 22 years, does the movement have a new angle, do you think?
Which movement?
I mean, the democratic movement.
Well, the democratic movement is a lot of people doing a lot of things. It includes the human rights movement, and I think there are some hopeful developments, and I think the rise of civil society groups that do environment, that do public health, that do women's rights, that do elderly rights, that is very, very important in China, but I don't know that it leads to a change of regime. It also helps the regime to manage social problems. Then among the overseas human rights groups, I think some of the work that we do with the UN agencies, the international legal arena, that's very important.
You mean the ICCPR?
ICCPR things, working with the Human Rights Council, working with the European governments that hold and American government that hold human rights dialogues with China, working with the various so-called special procedures or thematic mechanisms, as they are called, of the UN Human Rights Council. Those things, it's a very long, slow process, but I think they are important in continuing to promote the issue of China's compliance with its international human rights obligations under international law. I think the turnout of young people at the Victoria Park here in Hong Kong on June 4th was very important because it shows that the issue in Hong Kong of the political system in the mainland is still very important here. And Hong Kong is Chinese territory, and it's impossible for the government in Beijing to prevent Hong Kong people from thinking what they think and promoting
I
the
think
values.
not even Hong Kong locals. I think all of us were there on that night.
Yeah.
And in fact, we saw a lot of mainlanders.
A lot of mainlanders too.
People surround me talking about in Mandarin.
Oh yeah.
In fact, yes.
Most of them are not in Hong Kong. But,
So that's important.
Yeah, but after two decades, there is a new view that, not new in fact, of another model of developing China, a new development model, so-called China Consensus or China model, that would justify that the gunshots on that night, the decision of Deng Xiaoping, helped China to embark on a glorious voyage of gold rushing, in particular after 1992. So, do you agree to this thesis?
Well, China has achieved wonderful things, since 1992. So that's clear. And I think we have to give the leadership a lot of credit for that. They've been very smart as economic managers and so forth. Was it necessary to kill people to do that? There, I disagree. So I think, first of all, I agree more with Zhao Ziyang's point of view, not surprisingly, which is that the problem could have been settled peacefully through dialogue, and then China could have embarked on wonderful decisions and development that would have been even better if it had been solved peacefully.
So we move on to the discussion of Beijing Consensus, whether it exists and applicable to other parts of the world, other developing countries. How would you, or can you define the term Beijing Consensus for us?
It means different things to different people. So I think part of the Beijing Consensus is against the Washington Consensus as an economic model, which is a very heavy reliance on the market, and that the Beijing Consensus says that the state should take a leading role, and there should be more state control to help the major enterprises. Well, this is not a new thing. Japan did that, South Korea did that, Taiwan did that, and I think I'm not an economist, but it does seem to be one possible path to development at a certain stage of development, but it also has its problems, as we've also seen, for example, in Japan, when the state has played an active role and then it makes wrong decisions or it doesn't let go soon enough. So now, can other countries emulate that? Well, most other countries lack the technical experts, the bankers, the technicians, the engineers, and so forth to really make those kinds of good decisions. It lacks the bureaucratic capital to do so. Then if you interpret the Beijing Consensus as an idea that authoritarianism is the best kind of rule because it serves the community and keeps peace, here I think that it's not so convincing to me. It's more convincing to authoritarian rulers than it is to people around the world. I think people still, the Middle East revolutions are showing us that people still want their freedoms, and they still want their freedom of speech and their political accountability from the regime, and that the Chinese system has paid more and more of a price in repression for this. And again, I think it's very difficult for foreign regimes to emulate this because the Chinese system has such a huge, expensive propaganda bureaucracy and police bureaucracy that other countries don't have.
You just mentioned the experience of Middle East, Tunisia, and so forth, and it touches upon the issue of civilization, culture with democracy, the value of democracy. Is democracy a good thing for an old civilization like China? People said
This is not a universal value, actually.
India is a bad example. I have been hearing from my many mainland friends that democracy is not a good thing. It may suit the needs of the Westerners, but you see what happened in India is a counter example that a vast country cannot cater for the value of democracy. What do you think?
So, democracy, well, as Winston Churchill said, it's the worst system except for all the others. So democracy has a lot of faults, for sure, that we see in the United States. And we see them in India, we see them in Taiwan. But authoritarianism also has a lot of faults. And I think the Chinese system is working pretty well since 1992. I'm glad that is the case. But the fault of that kind of system is it depends too much on the wisdom of the few top leaders. And that cannot always be counted upon. And so during the Mao period, we had terrible disasters that took place. And also, an authoritarian system can never be fully accepted by the people. That's another problem. So even when a democratic system performs badly, it is still accepted by the people as legitimate. So democracy has a lot of problems, but I still think that, and as far as its suitability for China, you people in Hong Kong and people in Taiwan are very well placed to answer that.
Well, Taiwanese may not regard themselves as Chinese.
Exactly. The Taiwanese are Chinese, and the young people who came out in Victoria Park are Chinese, and so I think the culture is perfectly okay for democracy.
Last question. In 1993, Xu Tianjian and you wrote a journal article about cultural prerequisites for democracy.
Right.
I remember the argument and the research vividly because it touched upon my own sensitivity with democracy in China. You mentioned about the tolerance of Chinese peoples, in fact not very high compared to other East Asian countries. Do you still believe that majority of Chinese people are not that tolerant?
Well, I don't remember that article as vividly as you do, but so I'm trying to remember whether. So after that 1993 survey, Shi Tianjian has run other surveys in China. And to really answer your question, we just have to look at the data from the later surveys. But I think whenever you do surveys in a bunch of different countries, you're going to find different levels of answers. They're not going to be identical. The fact that whatever we reported in 1993 that the Chinese level of tolerance was less than someplace else, it doesn't mean that the Chinese people are unable to have a set of democratic institutions. I mean, in fact, whenever you have elections in China, even though they're very, very limited, they're able to conduct them.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Nathan.
You're welcome.
For being here tonight with us to share with us a lot of your expertise and opinions regarding China.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.